There's a pattern in history that keeps repeating not as a metaphor, but as an actual sequence. It brought down a monarchy that seemed permanent. It shattered the empire that ruled a continent. And it turned a seemingly prosperous island into a regime that lasted for generations. It happened to France in 1789, to Russia in 1917, and to Cuba in 1959. Different centuries, cultures, forms of rule, but the collapse follows the same order, stage by stage, as if the same mechanism keeps wearing different costumes. And this is the part that concerns me the most. Modern countries always think they are immune. Their institutions feel so stable, so advanced. But revolutions don't happen because a country is backward. They happen when expectations outrun reality and people stop believing the system can correct itself. Not because life becomes hard. Life has always been hard. It happens when life becomes unfair in a way that feels permanent. When the rules stop making sense. When the only thing that grows is the distance between what people were promised and what they can actually live. In this video, we're going to break this pattern down as a sequence. How revolutions actually work, why governments almost always miss them, and why the warning signs look obvious only in hindsight when it's already too late. Before we look at the pattern, I want to start with a clear definition, because the word revolution gets applied to everything – protests, riots, elections, even cultural shifts. But historically, a revolution means something much more specific. A revolution is the collapse of an existing political order and the sudden birth of a new one in its place. New rules are often built quickly, under pressure, fear and uncertainty. And here is the part that goes against what most people assume. Revolutions don't happen simply because people are poor. Poverty has existed in every century, in every system. If poverty alone caused revolutions, the world will be in constant upheaval. But revolutions happen at a very specific moment, when expectations rise faster than reality. When people begin to believe they deserve something better, something fairer and more stable, and the system repeatedly proves it can't deliver. Not once, but again and again, until disappointment turns into distrust. That is the point of no return. The moment when reform starts to feel impossible and the future starts looking like the closed door. John F. Kennedy captured this idea in one sentence. Those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable. It wasn't a call for violence, it was a warning. If a system blocks every peaceful way to change, correct or adapt, that pressure doesn't disappear. It builds, quietly at first, until eventually it has nowhere else to go. Across modern history, successful revolutions rarely explode out of nowhere. They tend to follow a recognizable arc, not identical in every country, but close enough that the sequence starts to feel familiar once you see it repeated. I will outline the stages and then we'll trace them through three historical cases. Stage 1. Inequality becomes not just real, but visible and insulting. People are comparing their lives and the lives of those at the top and see the gap, and the gap is huge. Stage 2. Government incompetence and corruption begin to destroy credibility. Mistakes pile up, scandals accumulate, promises stop meaning anything. No one believes the system can fix them anymore. Stage 3. The educated middle class starts turning against the system. And this stage matters. Revolutions rarely succeed on anger alone. They gain force when people with skills, education and social standing begin to withdraw their loyalty. Stage 4. Something deeper breaks. Faith in institutions. Courts, media, elections, the police. Structures that once felt permanent start to feel hollow. People stop feeling protection and stop expecting change. Stage 5. A disciplined revolutionary movement begins to grow. It should be an organization with a narrative, a plan, at least a promise that something new is possible. Stage 6. The old order finally falls. It's not always happen in one moment, not always cleanly, but once the structure gives way, what follows is rarely stability. Usually it's uncertainty, power struggles and the race to define what comes next. Now let's trace this through the historical examples. In the 1780s, France looked almost untouchable. It was a culturally dominant, powerful military, widely regarded as the center of European civilization. From the outside, it didn't resemble a country on the edge. And yet, within a few years, the monarchy was overthrown, the king was executed, and the country entered the period known as the Terror. If we map it against the pattern, the stages appear one by one. Inequality. France wasn't just unequal, inequality was written into the law itself. Society was divided into estates with different rights, protections and privileges. Some groups paid heavy taxes, others paid almost nothing. Over time, this gap stopped feeling natural and started feeling insulting. Incompetence. The state was financially collapsing under debt and poor management. Attempts at reform kept getting blocked by the very elites who benefited most from the status quo. The country could see the problem, but it couldn't fix it. The middle class turned. As I said, revolutions are rarely launched by the poorest alone. They gain momentum when the educated, organized, literate class decides the system has lost its legitimacy. In France, that meant lawyers, merchants and administrators, people who understood how the state worked, becoming the engine of resistance. The most vivid illustrations are Robespierre and Danton, who articulated the revolution ideas, organized its institutions, and drove its political machinery. Institutions lost credibility. The monarchy, the courts, the church, structures that once felt permanent and sacred started to feel hollow. People stopped seeing them as pillars of order, and they become seen as part of the problem. When moderates failed to stabilize the situation, food shortages, debt, public safety, more radical voices took over the conversation. Their messages was simpler: punishment, blame, urgency, instead of careful reforms and slow solutions. Then the system collapsed. The guillotine became a political tool, then a symbol, then for a time a routine. And violence turned into a method of governing. And here is the part of the pattern that I find most important. Revolutions often don't end with freedom, they end with a new concentration of power. France swung from monarchy to chaos, to terror, then to exhaustion, and eventually to Napoleon. The old order fell, but the vacuum it left behind didn't stay empty for long. This is what I would call the pattern inside the pattern. Revolutions break structures, but they also create openings. And in moments of instability, the strongest force fills the space. In 1917, the Russian Empire looked massive, ancient and immovable, stretching across continents, ruled by a dynasty that had lasted for centuries. From the outside, it seemed too big to fail, and yet the collapse came not over decades, but in months. The pattern begins the same way. Inequality was deep and visible. A small elite held power and privilege, while an enormous working population lived under harsh conditions with little voice in the how country was run. That alone had existed for generations, but, as I said, inequality becomes dangerous when it stops feeling inevitable and starts feeling unjust. Incompetence. The state struggled to modernize, struggled to govern effectively, and struggled to manage a country that was changing faster than its institutions could adapt. And then came the accelerant, World War I. Military failure is one of the fastest solvents of legitimacy. A government can survive poverty, it can survive corruption, it can even survive protests, but when it can't supply its own soldiers, when it sends them into disaster without equipment, without food and clear purpose, something breaks. The image of authority begins to dissolve. The middle class withdrew support, and more importantly, the military began to shift. This is an important detail. Revolutions become irreversible when soldiers stop believing. They start to hesitate to follow orders, and at the moment they refuse to fire, or simply walk away. Institutions collapsed in place. The monarchy no longer felt sacred. Parliament no longer felt powerful. The entire system started to feel like a shell, still standing but empty inside. And in that vacuum, the most disciplined group won. Not necessarily the largest, not the most popular, just the most organized, focused and ready. The Bolsheviks had something incredibly simple and incredibly powerful, a clear promise in 3 words: peace, land, bread. In a moment of chaos, 3 words can outweigh 100 pages of policy. Then came the aftermath: civil war, purges, famine, terror. The revolution had promised liberation, but the vacuum was filled by something harder and more centralized. And this is the same darker pattern repeating. When a system collapses completely, the people who rise to the top are rarely the most idealistic. They are often the most disciplined, the most coordinated, and the least constrained by moral hesitation. Cuba is one of the most misunderstood examples, because on the surface it didn't look like a country on the edge. On paper it seemed prosperous, tourism was booming, foreign investment was flowing in, Havana was full of casinos, hotels and money. From the outside, it gave the impression of growth and stability. But prosperity concentrated in one place can function as a kind of lie. The pattern begins the same way. Inequality was sharp and visible. Havana shined, but much of the countryside lived in deep poverty. Opportunity and wealth were clustered tightly in certain parts of society, while large parts of the population felt left out entirely. Corruption and repression. Batista's rule increasingly looked less like governance and more like a machine. Benefits for loyalists, violence for opponents. The state protected those who supported it and punished those who didn't. Over time, that erodes trust faster than almost anything else. The educated class radicalized. This is another element people often overlook. Fidel Castro wasn't leading a spontaneous peasant revolt. He was trained, educated, and politically driven. Revolutions gain momentum when people who understand the system decide it can be reformed from within. Legitimacy began to break. When people believe elections don't matter, courts are bought, and the police act as enforcers rather than protectors, the system stops feeling fixable. And once people stop believing change is possible through normal channels, they begin looking elsewhere. Mass support started to grow, sometimes just because of rejection of the current order. That is an important distinction. Revolutions are often fueled less by hope and more by rejection. And then came the collapse, followed by consolidation. The old structure fell, and a new one quickly hardened in its place. Cuba lives a difficult lesson. Some revolutions succeed because the old order becomes widely hated. But what comes next often survives for a different reason, not because hope stays strong, but because fear becomes stronger. So why do governments keep missing the pattern even when history has shown it so many times? Because people in power tend to confuse stability with permanence. If the institutions are still standing, the ceremonies still happen, and the uniforms are carrying authority, it feels like the system is intact. From the inside, everything can look solid, right up until the moment it isn't. But legitimacy is only a belief, a shared assumption that the system is fair enough, strong enough, and flexible enough to correct itself. And beliefs also don't collapse publicly and in a straight line. They erode in private over years, in conversations at kitchen tables, in jokes, in cynicism, in the moment someone stops expecting things to get better. From the outside, nothing seems to change. Elections still happen, speeches are still given, laws are still passed, but underneath the foundation weakens. And then, one day, something small happens, and what looked permanent suddenly feels fragile, because the belief holding everything together was already gone. Now, this section isn't about predicting a specific event or pointing to a fixed outcome. Revolutions don't follow calendars. But we can look at conditions, because conditions are measurable. And historically, the early signals tend to appear long before anything dramatic happens. I want to use the same three indicators – trust, institutional legitimacy, and inequality – and run them through two modern cases – the United States and Russia. Not to predict anything, but to stress test the sequence. And in case of Russia, to show something counterintuitive, whereas indicators don't automatically mean higher probability of revolution. The United States. The first signal is almost always trust. In late 2025, Pew Research Center data showed that only about 17% of Americans said they trust the federal government to do what is right just about always or most of the time. At the same time, large majorities reported dissatisfaction with how democracy is functioning. That doesn't mean collapse, but it does mean belief is weakening. The second signal is institutional legitimacy. When core institutions stop being seen as neutral, the ground begins to shift. The Supreme Court, for example, has seen approval ratings become deeply polarized, with growing skepticism about its impartially depending on political alignment. Once institutions are viewed as partisan tools rather than shared referees, their stabilizing role weakens. The third signal is inequality becoming not just large, but psychologically loud. Inequality has always existed, but what matters is visibility. The Federal Reserve tracks wealth concentration across groups, including the top 1% and even the top 0.1%, and long-term data through 2025 shows how much of total wealth sits at the very top. This isn't new. What changes is how strongly people feel the gap, how often they compare, and how permanent it starts to look. None of these numbers mean a revolution is guaranteed. They're not predictors, they're just stress indicators. Russia, the counterintuitive case. Now let's run the same indicators through a country we already examined historically – Russia. We looked at Russia in 1917. If we apply the same stress test to modern Russia, the picture looks, by most measures, even worse than in the United States. Inequality. Russia's Gini index rose to 0.419 in 2025. It's the highest level since 2012, growing for the fourth consecutive year. But the income Gini doesn't capture the full picture. By wealth concentration, Russia is in a league of its own. According to Credit Suisse and the UBS data, the richest 1% of Russians hold 56.4% of all national wealth, the highest figure in the world. The income of the wealthiest 10% is now 15.8 times higher than the income of the poorest 10%. And in 2025, Forbes included a record 155 Russians in its billionaire ranking. Trust in institutions. Here the picture becomes paradoxical. According to the Edelman Trust Barometer, Russia has ranked last or near last among 26 major economies in trust towards NGOs, media and businesses. Only 26% of Russians said they trusted the media, and 34% said they trusted their government in the broad sense. But according to the Levada Center's September 2025 data, trust in the president stands at 83%, in the army at 75%, and in the security services at 66%. In other words, Russians don't trust institutions in general, but they do trust the power vertical specifically. This is a fundamentally different structure of trust from what we see in the United States, where trust erodes across the board. In Russia, it concentrates at the top while hollowing out everywhere else. And yet, if we map this against our 6-stage sequence, something important is still missing. Stage 3, the moment when the educated middle class turns against the system, didn't happen in Russia. Or rather, it happened in a form that the sequence doesn't quite account for, I guess. After 2022, more than 800,000 Russians left the country. According to an analysis from the French Institute of International Relations, 86% of those who emigrated were under 45 and 80% had a college education. The IT sector alone lost around 100,000 professionals. Exactly the demographic that in France in 1789 became lawyers and administrators who could articulate, organize and spread revolutionary ideas. But in Russia, this group chose exit over voice, to use Albert Hirschman's framework. Instead of turning against the system from within, they left. And the system, rather than being destabilized by their departure, was in some ways stabilized by it. The people most likely to resist were no longer inside the country. At the same time, the war in Ukraine triggered a consolidation effect, what political scientists call rally around the flag. The Levada Center documented a sharp spike in institutional trust in 2022, similar to what happened after the annexation of Crimea in 2014. War in this context functions not as a destabilizer, but as a temporary adhesive. It fills exactly the trust gap that would otherwise move a society further along the revolutionary sequence. So we have two countries with deteriorating indicators. In one, the stress is distributed across the entire institutional landscape, and the educated class remains inside the system, growing more polarized and more frustrated. In the other, the indicators are objectively worse, but the mechanism of revolution is disrupted. The middle class has immigrated, and the war has temporarily propped up trust in the power vertical. This doesn't mean Russia is more stable. It means something different, and in some ways more concerning. The absence of a revolutionary mechanism is not the same as the presence of a healthy system. It is the absence of a correction mechanism. The pressure doesn't disappear, it simply has no internal channel through which to express itself. History shows that revolutions begin when enough people come to believe the system is rigged, unresponsive and unable to reform itself. In the United States, that belief is growing. In Russia, many of those who already held it have left. The question is, what happens when the consolidation effect of war fades and the people who remain begin to fill the gap that departed middle class left behind? That belief that the system cannot correct itself is the fuse. So, if we return to the central question, what actually causes revolutions, I would answer, it isn't just poverty. Poverty has existed in every era. It isn't corruption alone. Many systems survive corruption for decades. The deeper trigger is more structural and more psychological at the same time. A broken social contract combined with the collapse of trust. It begins when enough people start to believe the rules no longer apply equally, that elites live under one set of protections while everyone else lives under another, that institutions exist to shield the powerful rather than restrain them. that elections don't really change outcomes, that courts aren't neutral and the reform is performed like theater, but never truly delivered. When those beliefs settle in, anger stops being purely political. It becomes existential. People stop arguing about policy and start questioning the entire structure. And in that atmosphere, movements that promise simple, immediate justice become incredibly attractive. Even when they carry risks people would normally fear. This is why history keeps falling into similar patterns. Not because societies are naive, but because the incentives that shape power are remarkably stable, and human psychology doesn't change as quickly as technology or institutions. Power behaves the way power tends to behave. Trust builds slowly, erodes quietly, and once it's gone, it's very hard to restore. So the most important question isn't could it happen here? That question feels dramatic, but it misses the real mechanism. The better question is quieter. At what point does a society stop believing the system can correct itself? Because that moment is where the pattern begins to move fast. In short, revolutions are not random explosions. They follow a sequence that has repeated across centuries. From visible inequality to institutional collapse to the rise of whoever fills the vacuum. And the most uncomfortable part of this sequence is that the warning signs are always there. They just don't look like warnings at the time. They look like politics as usual until they aren't. If you want to continue examining these patterns together, subscribe to the channel and share in the comments which stage of this sequence you find most underappreciated. Let's keep training the habit of looking at history as a mechanism rather than a collection of stories.